Okay, I guess the real question is, anybody taken the tumble off of this stage yet? This is a pretty dubious, so mind it if you're coming down here. I'm going to just spend 5 to 7 minutes, is the time we've been allotted, to just talk a little bit about how resilience has been unfolding in USAID, some of the features of our attempts to institutionalize it. And I think, as you'll see from my presentation, and I think even my colleagues' presentations and discussions, this is all very much a work in progress, and we recognize that. What I think is interesting is we've actually got a few different types of models rolling out with different donors, so there is a real opportunity through sessions like this to learn from each other and draw from each other and sort of collectively come to a set of best practices. So one of the things I'm often asked when I'm asked to speak out about resilience is, what's actually different here? If we take as a starting point that almost all good development and a good chunk of what we do under humanitarian assistance under the guise of recovery, rehabilitation, contributes to resilience, what's fundamentally different about what we're doing through this resilience agenda? And I typically point to 3 things. The first one is a shift towards a developmental focus on people and places subject to recurrent crisis. And in our early iterations, the Horn and the Sahel, this has been a developmental focus where recurrent crisis has manifested itself as repeat large-scale humanitarian emergencies. And I think it really was, although this idea was kicking around for a number of years, it really was the drought in the Horn of Africa in 2011 that kicked off this interest. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're making it a developmental focus when I talk about what funding we're putting towards this. The second is, in the context of these dryland environments, is very clearly recognizing that shocks and stresses are perennial features of these landscapes, and as a result of that, a far heavier emphasis on risk, managing and reducing risk, building adaptive capacity, alongside some of our Feed the Future informed efforts of facilitating inclusive growth. And then finally, something that's had a lot of traction both within our agency and amongst our development and humanitarian partners is the extent to which we've actually brought our humanitarian development teams together to jointly define a problem, to jointly unpack that problem, and to jointly plan a response to address, through a series of investments, the underlying causes of recurrent crisis. And there's a number of ways we've done this. This was a sort of a catchphrase that some of us in USAID have become tired of saying, but this idea of sequencing, layering, and integrating our humanitarian and development investments. I think sequencing is probably most intuitive to people. It's sort of the almost an older model of a handshake. At what point do you transition from humanitarian to development assistance? There is still some appropriate places and types of investments where we are doing that, but I think the real advance here is what we're labeling layering and integrating. And I don't think it's worth getting into fine-tuned definitions of what falls under which category, but the idea is we're bringing different types of investments together in the same geographic space. We're using our humanitarian assistance programs as a platform, putting development investments on top of them. An example from Kenya is building on the work that WFP's been doing on asset creation through Food for Assets, and really targeting those areas for development investment so that we're building on that sustained platform of humanitarian assistance, but also, as the last bullet says there, making the types of investments that will actually get us out of this cycle of responding to recurrent crisis. And then the middle point there is also worth making, is that it's not as though, because of these development investments, that we now believe we're not going to be responding to humanitarian emergencies. We're fully cognizant of the fact that we will be, and that those responses need to be embedded in the strategy so that they don't undermine development and resilience gains. This is probably manifest most clearly through something we call a crisis modifier, which allows development partners to shift gears and deal with a crisis without undermining their development strategy. And I think that's something that worked in Ethiopia in 2011 and is now a feature of all of our targeted resilience investments. I think some of you have probably heard of something called a joint planning cell. This was something we created both in the Horn of Africa with a focus on Ethiopia and Kenya, and in the Sahel with a focus ultimately on Niger and Burkina Faso. And by joint planning cell, it was a mechanism through which we brought the development and humanitarian sides of USAID and the many flavors on each of those sides together in this thing I described earlier of a joint definition of a problem, a joint unpacking of that problem, and a joint set of investment decision-making. Those joint planning cells were a temporary fix for something that we didn't have inbuilt into our institutional infrastructure. And so, as much as we appreciate the gains made through the joint planning cells in the Horn and in the Sahel, and reserve the capacity to use that type of method in different contexts, we're really now trying, and this graphic tries to highlight it, although it's small, we're trying to embed that type of joint analysis into our country strategies, our 3 to 5 year country strategies, and I'll give a few examples in a minute. So what the JPCs could be thought of as a sort of work around the existing institutional infrastructure. The building into our country strategies is actually embedding resilience within our institutional framework. Okay, so where are we actually doing this? There's a few examples. In Ethiopia is probably our most forward-leaning case. Our involvement through the PSMP, early drylands investments, and now a series of joint planning cell investments. In Kenya, a series of new investments layering on WFP in the northern arid lands. Somalia and OFDA, which is our humanitarian assistance arm, and Food for Peace program, and the development side, putting together a joint program statement, so a jointly funded program. In Niger and Burkina Faso, this acronym RISE stands for Resilience in the Sahel Enhanced, but it is also, like the Horn, this combination of a series of building off both humanitarian investments, existing Food for Peace development programs, but a series of new investments in that same targeted geographic space. So those are sort of what I would call our flagship efforts, but we have a number of places where we're actually trying to embed this into the country strategies as I described. Nepal is an early example where we've got it as a central frame in the country strategy, and we are also complementing that with some strategic additional investments to make it real. In Yemen, we've made great strides in having our humanitarian and development sides jointly develop the 3-year country strategy there. It's a challenging environment, and how that translates onto work on the ground still remains to be seen. Uganda has great potential in terms of relooking at our investments in Karamoja. That's also on hold a little bit for the time being, but the desire to use resilience as a framework for bringing together a set of programs that aren't inherently linked to each other. Mali, we're also looking at how resilience can help guide the country strategy there. And then South Sudan, although it's not as explicit, the concept of resilience is built into the relook of our food security program in there. The one point I do want to make is we've got these sort of top set, which are the obvious cases, recurrent crisis, huge humanitarian outlays each few years. Those are our flagship. They're the place where the economic rationale for this is very powerful. We're in the process now of looking at how resilience of a concept, what is the broader utility? What is the broader utility in countries like Nepal, Yemen, Mali, et cetera? And then even beyond that, when we look at Feed the Future, when we look at Food for Peace and OFDA programming, how can we use resilience as a concept to inform those entire platforms? And then I think this actually speaks a lot to how resilience has actually played out in USAID. And I know one of the questions that's going to be asked is, are we putting funds aside specifically for resilience? And in fact, the answer is we don't have a resilience funding stream. This is an example of how we've funded our focused effort in Niger and Burkina Faso. You may not know all these different types of funding streams, but within the US government, within USAID, we actually have a number of initiatives, let's just say that. And a lot of earmarked money, and there has been a tendency to have that, if we're not going to different countries, going to different parts of the same country. And what we've done here is actually, through a joint analysis, through a joint articulation of the investments needed, gone back, in the case of the Sahel, and articulated the types of funding we need to bring together in a joint effort. And a good number of these are actually co-funding of single projects within a platform of about 11 layers. And then finally, I wanted to show you sort of how we're sort of combining humanitarian development assistance. Again, this is for one project in the Sahel for Niger and Burkina Faso. And you'll see the vision of a sustained development investment and a decreasing burden on the humanitarian side in terms of its lift on resilience, recognizing that there'll still be this need for humanitarian response in the future. And then finally, just in terms of the architecture within USAID, it's something we're still struggling with. Where do you put resilience in an agency defined by bureaus? We can very easily say that if we put it in a single bureau, we kill the idea that we're launching here. So what we do have as a sort of temporary structure is a resilience leadership team chaired by Nancy Lindberg with a number of senior level people from all bureaus, a very small resilience secretariat, which I'm a part of, and then a broad technical working group drawing from throughout the agency. So I think I've already gone over time, but that's just a sense of where we are in resilience in USA.
Thanks, Greg.